All right, so our next speaker is Alessandra Marchi.
Marchi.
My apologies. Alessandra Marchi. She's currently working as a scientific coordinator of the GramsciLab, Laboratory of International Gramscian Studies, Department of Political Sciences at the University of Cagliari.
Yeah.
She works with Patricia Manducci, professor of history and culture of the Arab and Islamic world, and they recently edited the volume of on Gramsci in the Arab world, which collected different articles of Arab intellectuals translated into Italian. She is currently working on the Gramscian readings of the MENA region, especially after 2011 and the post-revolutionary period. She did research on the Italian community in Egypt and on the Egyptian uprising with fieldwork in Cairo and Alexandria at the French CNRS during the period of 2009 to 2014. She also worked at the Antonio Gramsci House Museum in
Ghilarza. This is so difficult to pronounce.
Her presentation today is The Time for Counter-Hegemony, Reading Post-2011 Arab Uprising Phase. So without further ado, please welcome Alessandra Marchi.
Thank you. I don't know if I say or if I sit. Oh. So thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's always interesting and to share research with universities and with students and the other public, especially for us coming from a southern peripheral university as that one in Cagliari, where I work. So I try to put some methodological and heuristic questions on the reading of the post-revolutionary period. So maybe if we have questions on the Egyptian and Tunisian revolution in particular, but I want to point out some important questions, drawing them from Gramsci, from a Gramscian analysis. And so I will start to think about the slogan of the Egyptian regime. Ashabi yurid isqat nizam. The people want to topple the regime. This was the slogan demanding the fall of the Egyptian regime in 2011. During the famous few weeks from 25 January to 11 February 2011, when Mubarak was overthrown, people realized that they were partaking in a popular and permanent revolution that involved worker movements and trade unions, youth and elderly, women, associations and citizens from the larger civil society. This one is another important concept in Gramscian terms. But today we know that counter-revolutionary forces stopped this historical uprising, and so they stopped the possibility within the revolution to achieve its goals. Bread, freedom and social justice above all. After 7 years since the outbreak of the Arab uprisings, many observers discuss the correctness to call revolution those revolts in the Arab countries, which overthrew the heads of the old regime like Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, and led then to extreme chaos across all the MENA regions, as we can see unfortunately today even in Syria and Libya. As social scientists and political analysts continue to discuss the language appropriate to define those Arab revolts, Gramscian concepts can be very, very useful to understand the revolutionary and post-revolutionary moments. Indeed, we can observe today the great and growing appeal of the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci. His political and philosophical thought is among the most and worldwide influential in the 20th and 21st century now. While its different political uses, changing meaning and interpretations show how Gramsci's reception is linked to the political and cultural circumstances of each context. Like the Belgian scholar Brecht de Smet explains in his book Gramsci on Tahrir, what is useful here is to deploy Gramsci's concept to construct new forms of understanding appropriate to the present in a more dialogical and interdisciplinary way. So we can draw from Gramsci some important lessons to ask if and how and to which extent the 2011 uprising have transformed society, because this is the objective of every revolutionary project. And we can ask if we can integrate, so a Gramscian reading of popular contentious politics in a broader theoretical frame. The concepts of hegemony, so I put just some slides just to put Gramsci in the Marxist and post-Marxist perspective, but of course Gramsci goes beyond. And this is a mural in Sardinia, in a village where Gramsci is really represented. So the concept of hegemony is probably the most known and influential Gramscian concept during the last century. And we may consider it as the starting point to interpret the present global crisis. Gramsci spoke about the crisis of hegemony, which occurs either, here we have some, I want to just to put, Gramsci spoke about the crisis of hegemony, which occurs either because the ruling class has failed in some major political undertaking for which it has requested or forcibly extracted the consent of the broad masses, or because huge masses have passed suddenly from a state of political passivity to a certain activity, and put forward demands which, taken together, albeit not organically formulated, add up to a revolution. A crisis of authority is spoken of. This is precisely the crisis of hegemony, or general crisis of the state. I think this first concept of hegemony speaks about the crisis of hegemony everywhere, not only in the MENA region, of course. And for Gramsci, power is based on domination and on the exercise of direction, for which it's important to play an intellectual and moral leadership of different organizations of people. He spoke, of course, of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie for the formation of the new states. Power is not only to use coercive apparatus to achieve and maintain its role, but the dominant class is not a cohesive or monolithic bloc. And this is why the forms of hegemony on which it relies can be undermined by different factors and challenges, coming notably from the civil society, as we've seen. And as well, for Gramsci, civil society is not a fixed and defined space and category, but it's articulated in various private organizations aiming for the ideological and cultural hegemony within society, and so within the state. We can also see how civil society is becoming more and more disaggregated, and this one is also a characteristic that Gramsci attributed to the subaltern groups, who have to face the domination and the leadership, so the hegemony of the authoritarian states, and eventually act for an alternative hegemonic project. The dominant classes can be overthrown, as we've seen, like every historical relation of force. That is a major result obtained in 2011 by the Egyptian and Tunisian people, at least, concretely and in terms of historical and political consciousness. So we have also to think on what hegemonic processes exclude or make subaltern. So we are invited to expand our understanding of how hegemony works and how hegemony in Gramscian terms works, of course. So we can enrich the Gramscian analysis and ask if another hegemonic project or more localized projects are really possible or they are already at work. It's well known how the political struggle is no more confined to traditional institutions, but it involves the entire civil society, where the common sense is shaped and where people experience or endure strong pressure to change, that are also due to the implosion of an economic neoliberal model which is still generating inequalities and absorbing the same crises and subalternities that it reproduces at many levels and geographies. So hegemony is made by dominion and coercion, and by direction and consent. So the consent can be passive or active consent. And it develops in a bilateral relation between rulers and ruled, between leaders and led, between dominant and subaltern. And as Gramsci says, the history of the subaltern groups is necessarily fragmented and episodic. there does exist a tendency to unification in the historical activity of these groups, but this tendency is continually interrupted by the activity of the ruling groups. So, if the subaltern groups are subject to the activity of ruling groups, they are subject even when they rebel and rise up. If we want to focus on this episode of rebellion, we have to look at every trace of independent initiative on the part of the subaltern groups, and this is a Gramscian quotation too. So following his approach, we can also look to the molecular transformations and different social and political praxes as a way to construct the history, not only from below, but in its effective dialectical perspective. This kind of inventory calls once again to the analysis in Gramscian terms of spontaneism, strategy, and organization of the masses, of the subaltern. Once that we made this kind of inventory, we can speak about revolution and post-revolutionary moment. Many scholars, many analysts agree on the fact that the failure of the revolutionary camp in the Arab world has primarily been attributed to the lack of organization, which led to the emergence of the conflict between two wings of the counter-revolution that are still at work, as John spoke for Morocco too. So the authoritarian regimes and the reactionary Islamist movements. Again, Brecht Desmet, in his work, investigates the lack of a directive central or national leadership after the first phase of the Egyptian revolution. To challenge the established power and to achieve their goals and integrate social and political momentum, popular masses would have to construct a means of exercising power, through which establish its hegemony over the revolution. But the failure to accomplish these two crucial moments and political steps between 2011 and 2013 led to the consolidation of the military-directed counter-revolution, at least in Egypt. But the elite's power can be more subtle, and allowing sometimes some forms of democratic participation, suspending, for example, the constitutions or reforming constitutions, or calling for the security of the nation with the emergency laws that we can see in Egypt, but also in other countries, calling to the police repression, or just controlling elections without rivals, like it happened in Egypt 1 month ago, again, after 2014, when Al-Sisi and the military overthrown the Morsi democratic elected government. So, even participation in elections and referenda during the past few years paradoxically contributed to weaken the revolutionary forces and the social movements, who have to fix their politics with corporate interests too. But if one result of the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions has been the foregrounding of a consciousness and a critical elaboration of what their social and political reality was, yet the debate concerns more the failure of the long revolutionary dynamics than their achievements. Of course, we are obliged to think about and to analyze all those failures and lack of strategies. But we have to think also that the protagonists of the revolution at their starting phase had a first consciousness and will to break the system of rule and to break the status quo. But at the same time, they couldn't know exactly what to want, and so they couldn't know how to project and fulfill their future. In 2011, the enthusiasm and euphoria about a glorious collective action undermined this preparatory work, or this intense critical activity, in Gramscian terms again, that is necessary to make a revolution victorious in terms of real changes. During this fragile phase, the fragmented masses can also express disparate wills and needs, including reform and restoration, the famous morbid symptoms quoted by Gramsci, when the old is dying and the new cannot be born, is another sentence by Gramsci. So when the chaos and the peril appear as too heavy costs for the everyday life, so it was also a normal ongoing process in this way. So Gramsci again tells us that to be effective, the subaltern struggle must be founded on a conscious leadership, which he describes as political activity informed by revolutionary theory and rooted in a systematic understanding of the historical conditions that define subalternity. But we never have pure conditions to guarantee an itinerary, and today we can see as political parties have shown all their limits in terms of attractiveness and agency, even if maybe they can still be effective in terms of strategy and, of course, of chronism. But we also have to remember another important point, that is to go beyond the passive fatalism, as Gramsci said, and it's important to unite individuals and masses, not only under a party, or eventually the Communist Party, but at first through the Sorelian spirit of cleavage. In Italian is spirito di scissione. I have some... the spirit of cleavage means the progressive acquisition of the consciousness of one's historical identity, which has to extend to all potential allied classes. And this is a precondition for every counter-hegemonic praxis. So even if rare, there always exist conditions favorable to the transformation of society and culture. But what is fundamental in this case is to develop the capacity to lead. This is the main concept for hegemony, the capacity to lead, which prelude to the fight against the power and against the class enemies, and the possibility to subvert the social order. For example, if we think to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they try to act for a cultural transformation of society with the aim to counterbalance the state power, and they deployed, even if not deliberately, a counter-hegemonic strategy with huge limits, of course, and little political success, as they have been repressed or co-opted by the regime, historically and recently too, and notably under Mubarak, when both influence on society spread and the regime's control strengthened. For an analysis of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic in counter-hegemonic terms, you can read Hazem Kandil, who teaches in Cambridge. So on the limits of the counter-hegemonic strategies of the Muslim Brotherhood. But we can also think to other counter-hegemonic powers like the UGTT in Tunisia, so the Federation of the United for the Unions, Workers' Unions, for example. So if Gramsci thought above all in terms of proletariat and peasants, today we have to include more other categories, of course, in the subaltern groups. We must consider, for example, other less formal or less organized forms of resistance and opposition. We can think to precarious and informal workers, for example, to self-management experience in many contexts, to minorities and migrants, of course, and to spontaneous and temporary movements, like Kifaya was in Egypt, for example, in 2004. And Kifaya was a large movement, not a political party, where many people joined from the left, from the Islamist field also, from workers, students. So everybody wanted to join in a campaign to reform the state. Or there are many campaigns in Tunisia that are very interesting to study, because they are really temporary campaigns. Once they achieve their goal, for example, the reform of the recent financial law in Egypt in 2000, at the beginning of this year, with the campaign Fesh Nestanyahu, after they pass to another campaign, maybe. So many individuals move among political and social campaigns. But of course, it's not easy to think to such a composite majority acting in a counter-hegemonic terms against a bigger enemy antagonist, that is the dominant class, the regime, or the neoliberal ideology. We can pay attention instead to the multiplication of fights and counter-power organizations and actions as a new strategy of resistance from below. If no more assault to a monolithic, dominant, or unique bloc is possible, we need to look at the spread of power and its effects on different scales. And here, a Foucauldian analysis can be very useful to compare to the Gramscian one. Another important, very important feature that is constitutive of the hegemony and that we have to consider as a major limit to the efficacy of the social struggles from below comes from the manufacture of consent. So hegemony is not only made by the use of force, of course, but on the fabrication of consent, we can say. So Gramsci argues that civil society is a space where ruling elites, by establishing their ideological hegemony, win the consent of the ruled, rather than rule by brutal coercion or exert repression. Since the early 2000s, we have seen an important resurgence of street politics in a way that maybe reconfigured the historical bloc in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in other countries. The historical bloc is the bloc that is antagonist to the dominant class. Again, it's not maybe a monolithic bloc, of course, and it's quite fragmented. And in fact, among this bloc, for example, new relations were established between the leftists, the Nasserists, the Islamists, the students, etc. Even if the critique sometimes is that especially the leftists, but also the Islamists remained, or they are perceived as far from the subaltern groups. But they try to join, above all, after the second Palestinian Intifada and the anti-war protests linked to Afghanistan and Iraq invasion, which gathered thousands of people in the squares of the Arab cities and pushed the formation to new movement like Kifaya and the others that we have seen, especially in the urban context. So, relatively new forms of protest and pressure on political society are pushing through a renegotiation of the state-civil society pact. The field of action is a diluted or a more open civil society which hosts everyone. Associations, NGOs, forum, campaigns, individuals supporting the temporary struggles that are, have been called by the sociologist Asef Bayat as non-movements. So in the end, we need to define for each context the specificity of its civil society if we want to understand what kind of counter-hegemony is possible to achieve in the specific context and by who in the broader civil society in the Arab war, who can be excluded. There are many political or social actors who act to destroy or weaken the civil society. So, do we have to account them inside the civil society, or do we have to exclude them from this huge field? It's a shared opinion today that civil society is losing its substance to become a fluid space of low-cost democratization, where conflicts are often normalized and calmed down by anti-violence or pro-security claims made by the ruling classes and reinforced by authoritarian repression and abuse of force. And as it happens in Egypt, in every fragile or authoritarian state. To give again an example, under the void created with the overthrow of some Arab leaders, the Muslim Brotherhood, as observed by many, could get consensus in Egypt, uniting instrumentally the new Islamist bourgeoisie, of whom they are an expression, and the urban proletariat, both dissatisfied by the government of the country. But again, the relations of production and the capital accumulation have not been questioned by Islamist counter-hegemonic projects, and they are not by military, because they want just to rule an Islamized society, but without contesting the economic capitalist system. So maybe the counter-revolutionary character of the military and of the Islamists have been underestimated at the beginning, of course. And this is why today we can say that these two counter-revolutionary forces betrayed the hopes and grievances of the masses, and both created and encouraged cleavages within the revolutionary camp that is polarized between secularists and Islamists. Of course, the Arab left is not without responsibility in this project, and the critics are not spared by and against intellectuals and activists, probably because of their disengagement in the counter-hegemonic struggle, and notably since the post-Soviet period, when gradual change has become the main acceptable way to transform in society. But everywhere the left is in crisis, and it seems to have abandoned its leading role in class and social struggle, while the new, often informal movements and non-movements lack of a strategic vision. A vision instead that can possibly emerge if we look at the different ways of collective action and wills that go beyond the borders of an economic class, that go beyond a generic subaltern majority, or go beyond the democratic but abstract idea of the people. And we have also to account the individualization processes and the mobile political activities inside this fluid civil society, and of course the social network too. So I'm going to finish with an interesting advice coming from the Tunisian sociologist Tahar Labib, who was a pioneer of the Gramscian studies in the Arab world. And he considered that, notably in some Marxist movements, the fight against hegemony aimed at an alternativist and essentialist objective, meaning by that it was anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-class domination, etc. While later, paradoxically maybe, this kind of vision, which emerged in a strictly controlled civil society, disappeared in the actual freed civil society as it pretends to be after 2011 revolution. So political actors tried to position themselves within the revolutionary hegemony and civil society. That becomes a simple space of negotiation or a space of solidarity to respond to the threat of religious terrorism, for example. But the results for Labib consist in deep withdrawals in the political and social struggle, which were the main grievances at the beginning. So while we are wondering if the Arab uprisings are or not revolutions, if there are revolutions without revolutionaries, this is the book of Asef Bayash, but also we can ask if there are revolutionaries without revolutions. And even if the pessimism of the intellect is a realistic approach, if we look at the reality around us, with transformism and reactionary politics, we can't neglect the extent of contentious politics from below, for which it's very important to constantly update the repertoire of collective actions and movements of protest that, in their complex, may represent a part of the global struggle over a different governance. So they move toward a global common goal. The critique of neoliberal capitalist hegemony is not yet mature, because organic crises are usually overcome by capitalism itself, which is more likely to recreate new and different forms of capitalism instead of an alternative hegemony. But nonetheless, we can't be unprepared to answer, following Gramsci again, how changes have been prepared molecularly, it's even with independent initiatives. Until they generate a new situation or transformation, even in the economic field. This is an essential question of method. As every social order is the product of dialectical hegemonic practices, it means that it can always be subject to a counter-hegemonic challenge. And this is an historical realization that can also shape new and improving power relations. So Gramsci is important for us because it enabled us to step outside the Eurocentric narration of modernity and to confront with multiple stories of the others, which are already at work to create the current history of different regions of the world, and notably the Arab regions, that we must know today. So Gramscian interpretations and insights themselves can be improved and renewed by this interdisciplinary dialogue. Thank you very much.
All right, so now we will have another 20 minutes of Q&A. And anyone?
How would Gramsci account for social media and its role in revolutions? And
How
would Gramsci account for social media as like a kind of, you've got the kind of capitalist side and you can see things promoted on Twitter, and political leaders now have got Twitter accounts. It's like, so spreading propaganda and then people contacting each other through it.
Mm-hmm.
So how would he account for that as a kind of form for gender?
Oh, I think, for example, in the USA, one of the main fields in which Gramsci studies is the construction of hegemony by the media and the social media. So it's really important. I didn't speak about the formation of this huge interest in all the subjects. Of course, he couldn't account at this time from the social media, but he was really attentive to the role of the private organization and for all the apparatuses from the civil society. So the press and the media for him, they were really very important to shape the public opinion. So once again, we can use Gramsci also to study the role of the social media, the press, and etc. I don't know if I answered your question.
You said that, sort of a question really, if the Arab uprisings are revolutions without revolution, is that the view of actually the movement, that a revolution wasn't really happening?
Of the movement?
The movements themselves, the protesters, is that the view that a revolution wasn't really happening?
No, I think that at the beginning, of course, and later on, the view inside the movement and the composite movement was about a revolution. We call the Arab Spring, but with a Eurocentric vocabulary, but it was called Thawra for the protagonist. So I think, and I believe that a revolutionary moment was effectively happening in 2011 and at least until 2013. Maybe now we can speak about a post-revolutionary moment because we don't still have a movement, a big movement, but it really spread. This was the capacity of the hegemonic classes to weaken the revolutionaries. Revolutions without revolutionaries is the title of a book of Asef Bayat, an Iranian sociologist who teaches in the United States. That is very interesting because he analyzes these movements, non-movements. So how the social movements and the political movements and activism are changing. But I think that we can put the question on the opposite too. So, do we have revolutionaries? But maybe we don't have revolutions in this precise moment because the movement is so weakened and fragmented now.
Thank you.
I guess I have what do you think in terms of the idea of counter-hegemony, and specifically when talking about Egypt, that it cannot be applied given that Egypt is not simply the military establishment, but there's a so-called deep state.
Yeah.
And so any form of counter-hegemony would not be as productive as it would be given that, like in 2011 when Mubarak was ousted, there was only just the representation of, shall we say, the first layer. So what would you say in regards to that?
At first, we have to keep in mind that counter-hegemony is not a concept really explored by Gramsci. For Gramsci, there's an hegemony, and of course, the possibility to reverse and to challenge and change the status quo. So, in this sense, many people spoke then about a counter-hegemonic project. I think it's the real, the huge question today: is a counter-hegemonic project possible? I think that if we want to think in a counter-hegemonic approach, we have to think to destabilize the neoliberal world order. So it's impossible. We have to say that in this sense, in this respect, we are pessimistic. But I think that what's important is to look at those molecular transformations, all those new ways to do politics and to resist from below. And maybe we have to think to different anti-hegemonic projects, counter-hegemonic projects. Maybe we won't see, not our generation, a counter-hegemony inside our states, inside the MENA, but also in the West, I think. So maybe we have to think to local counter-hegemonic projects, more forces that can challenge the power. But I think it's really difficult to think in terms of an hegemonic field and a counter-hegemonic field, because those two fields are, there is a deep state and there is also a deep society. So it's an ongoing project, I think. The revolution is never achieved, I think. It's a process. Finally, I didn't show you the slides. I forgot to tell you that, for example, Gramsci, some problems with the Gramscian analysis outside the philological approach comes from the fact that Gramsci is quite always read in other languages, not in Italian, not in the original language. If you think that it's one of the most influential revolutionary thinker of the 20th century, we still don't have an integral translation of the prison notebooks in English, even in English. And if you read the English translations, sometimes it's difficult to think that is the translation from Italian, so from a quite close language too. And Gramsci is important to read the MENA regions more and more, but mainly from Western scholars, and it's written also, is read also by Arabic scholars, but they read with secondary literature, so from English and French translations mainly. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.